Who said encore? Yes, amen. Encore. No, maybe not. Okay. All right, so we in our Bible study now. We're in Acts chapter 25. And we stopped in verse 9. But I think in order to get the flow of it, we'll pick up in verse 9. But to get the flow of it, we should start reading. Let's start reading in verse 7 and read down through the end of verse 12. Okay? So I'm going to read Acts 25, verses 7 through 12. And then we'll pick up on the verse-by-verse study in verse 9. Starting in verse 7, And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against him, against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of those things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. So, in chapter 24, Paul was tried before Felix. And Felix kept Paul pretty much under house arrest for 2 years because he was waiting for what? What was he waiting for? Money. Looking for a bribe, which Paul never paid. And then finally, Felix PCS'd. And he moved on to his next military assignment. And this new guy comes in, Festus. And from last week, what do you know, or what can you tell me about the kind of man that Festus was? Does anybody remember? What kind of man was he? All right, yes, moving right along. Getting some good answers here. Do you remember? Does anybody remember anything? I'm feeling kind of bad here.
You said he was by the book type of guy?
Yeah, he's a by the book kind of guy. He's pretty straight up when it came to observing the Roman policies and procedures at the time. However, would you describe Festus as being sympathetic toward Paul's cause? Just from what we've read, does it sound like that, he cares about Paul? I don't get that feeling either. I get the feeling like he doesn't really care one way or the other, but rules are rules. And so he's going to kind of keep those rules. And so we ended in verse 8 last week where Paul was able to answer for himself. And remember from chapter 24, we found in chapter 24 that Paul is not only very skilled in the Old Testament law, but he's very skilled in defending himself too. And we've seen that several times where he splits the Sanhedrin by saying, I'm called in question over the resurrection. And of course that caused problems. And everything that he did from there until now, we've seen Paul as a very able lawyer, if you will, in his own defense. And so now he speaks before Festus in verse 8 and says, I haven't done anything wrong. I have not offended the law of the Jews. I haven't done anything against the temple. I haven't done anything against Caesar. I have not done anything. So verse 9, Festus answers. And he says, and we're told that Festus was willing to do the Jews a pleasure. You might remember from last week where we found the same thing as he goes down to, remember, he goes to Jerusalem, and because he's a new guy on the block, and so he goes to Jerusalem and he meets with the head, the head of the Jewish religion down there, and he talks to them for a while, and he's down there for, I think it was 10 days, and then he comes back up and he says, now, if you've got anything to accuse Paul of, come on up with me, and we'll take care of it right there. And so Festus is really trying to stay on the Jews' good side. And here it says he is willing to do the Jews a pleasure. So he's willing to do whatever he can to keep the Jews happy, but he's not willing to break with the laws in order to do that. So it says he's willing to do just a pleasure. So he answered Paul, which, he's asking Paul a question here. And the question is, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Why would he ask this question? This kind of goes back to last week too. Why would he ask this question? He asked Paul to go to Jerusalem. Let's all travel together, basically. Me and these guys here and you, Paul, we'll all travel together. We'll go back to Jerusalem and then you can answer before me. Why would he say that? Why doesn't he say, hey, Paul, I got a great idea. Let's travel over to, we're here in Caesarea, but let's travel from Caesarea. Let's go to Bethlehem, or let's go to, Nazareth. Or why specifically does he say Jerusalem? Maybe that's a better way to ask the question. Do you remember what the Jews said when he went to visit? They said, can you bring him to Jerusalem? Send him to Jerusalem. In their mind, they wanted to kill Paul, but Festus doesn't know that. He doesn't know that he knows that they want to kill Paul, but they think he wants to kill Paul legally. What they had in mind was catching him on the road somewhere and just, having some hired bandits or something, just kind of rush in and kill him. But Festus doesn't know that, but he wants to keep them happy. So he's going to kind of go middle of the road here, and he says, I got a great idea. Let's all go back to Jerusalem. So it's an interesting statement because if you recall, he didn't want to bring Paul down to Jerusalem while he was there. He told him no, he needs to be tried in Caesarea. But now, having heard their accusations and having heard Paul's defense, now he's willing to go back to Jerusalem with Paul. And it might be, I don't know, this is my opinion here, but it might be that initially he just didn't know how much the Jews really desired to have Paul. I mean, he only talked to them for, a week or 10 days there. So maybe he didn't know exactly how strong their desire was, but now he knows. And knowing that, now maybe he's willing just to kind of take him back to Jerusalem and have trial. But he's going to be the one in charge. He says this, he says, there be judged of these things before me. So he's not turning over his authority to the Sanhedrin. He's going to go back with them. But they're going to do it in Jerusalem. But Paul is not he is a Jew. Let me say that differently. Paul is a Roman citizen. Roman citizens had a special level, I guess, or another level of protection against them. They had certain rights under the Roman law that others didn't enjoy. And so Paul had appealed to Caesar. And so what happens here? Festus can't go against that. He says to Paul, you want to go back to Jerusalem? Now, Paul could say yes and go back to Jerusalem. Paul also does not know that they're probably waiting to kill him somewhere in the mountains. He doesn't know that either. He has to suspect it, but he doesn't really know for sure. But he doesn't go that route. Paul doesn't say, all right, let's go back to Jerusalem. Why not? If he's innocent, and the judge is still going to be Festus, and he probably ought to be let free, who cares what city court happens in? But he does care. Why? Any ideas? Why did he appeal to Caesar? I don't think we've actually answered that part of the question yet. Yes, sir. Yes, we are. Paul knew that he was supposed to go to Rome. Legitimately, the way it was supposed to work, he's there in Jerusalem. They have a trial in Jerusalem, and whoever's, maybe the what do we call them? Not the victim, what's the other word I'm looking for? Defendant, the accused. There we go. The accused would have a trial in Jerusalem. All right? If the local authorities, the Jewish government, the Sanhedrin, said you are guilty and the penalty for you is death. They couldn't kill him because they didn't have the authority to execute a death sentence. So they had to take that sort of sentence before the Romans. Now the local Roman guy in Jerusalem could take the case And if he felt like it needed to go farther, he would get sent up to the next level, basically an appeal, and that was in Caesarea. So he was supposed to go to Caesarea, and then after Caesarea, he was supposed to go on to Rome. But the next step would not be to go back to Jerusalem. Paul knows he's supposed to go to Rome. So he is not going to go back to Jerusalem and start the process all over, especially knowing that chances are good that they're going to try and kill him again. So we can understand why Paul says, no, I'm not going back there. So in verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. Wait a minute. Was Paul standing before Caesar at this present moment? No. He's standing before Festus. But he calls it Caesar's judgment seat. Why? Boy, you guys are really a hard crowd today. It's Rome. It's Caesar's judgment seat because it belongs to Caesar. Festus belongs to Caesar. Everything Roman belonged to Caesar. So he says, no, I'm here before Caesar's judgment seat. And then he goes on to say, after that, he says, where I ought to be judged, to the Jews I have done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. I don't know, but I think that's kind of bold, So Paul is not exhibiting fear of Felix at all. I'm sorry, Festus at all. He's not showing fear. He says, no, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. I am innocent and you know it. That's what he says. You know it. Can you imagine being Festus at that moment? Where the accused is now accusing you of not being totally, above board on this whole thing. You know I'm innocent. And so at this point, Paul does a couple of things here, which probably should be considered separately. First, he points out he's appealed to Caesar's judgment. So Festus doesn't have the right to stop this from happening. He's appealed. He's a Roman citizen. And it would have been a violation of Paul's rights as a Roman, and Festus then would have been in big trouble. So he can't do that from a legal aspect. I think it's kind of interesting that Paul knew, we discussed this, Paul knew he was supposed to go to Rome. Jesus had already told him that in Acts 23 verse 11. Paul knew it was God's will to go to Rome. He didn't know all that would happen to him at Rome, but he knew he was supposed to go there. And Paul was willing to bring it about, even if it meant that he had to stay a prisoner. You remember what's happened here. In Acts 22, what's his name? Lysias, the chief, what do they call him? The chief soldier. He knew that Paul wasn't guilty. He knew, but yet they have to take him, and they take him up to Caesarea. They sneak him out of town. Remember the story. And when he gets there, he is now before Felix. And Felix knows that he's innocent, but he can't release him, or he won't release him. Now Festus knows too, but nobody's able to release him because Paul appealed to Caesar. So even if they found him innocent, and at one point, and we'll see this a little bit later, at one point the statement is made, if he had appealed to Caesar, we'd have released him. But they can't. He's got to go. So Paul was willing to stay a prisoner to make sure that he gets to Rome. But the second thing is that, and this is really revealing, he makes this statement that Felix knows that he's done nothing wrong. You know, Felix, I'm innocent. You know this. Or I'm sorry, Festus. I keep saying Felix. Festus knew that he had done nothing wrong. So in a very subtle way, and it's not really all that subtle actually, Paul is telling Festus, I know your motives. That's what he's saying. I know your motives. And I don't know about you, but I don't really like it when my motives aren't right and somebody says, I know your motives. That's kind of, sorry. It kind of makes people feel a bit unnerved. And this is what Paul does. Now look at verse 11. He says, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. In other words, Paul's saying, if I'm guilty and I deserve death, okay, I'm getting what's coming to me. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. So humanly speaking, Paul would have had good cause to appeal to Caesar, because it appears that all the way up the line, really, except for Lysias, it kind of sounds like nobody else has been treating Paul very fairly. Did you notice that? I mean, Lysias kind of protects him and keeps the Sanhedrin from killing him. But then he takes him up to Felix. Felix knows he's innocent, but Felix doesn't release him. He keeps him under house arrest for 2 years, and he keeps dragging him out to have conversations with Paul, because he's hoping at some point that Paul's going to come up with a little money, which Paul never does. Instead, he stays under house arrest, and then Felix leaves and Festus comes in. In fact, Festus is kind of a hard-nosed guy. He's going to do things the right way. And so Paul, up to this point, has really not been treated very fairly. And it looks now that Festus is predisposed to give the Jews what they want. So Paul kind of closed that door, and he says, and he understands that Festus has a knowledge of his innocence. And so under these circumstances, he knows that Paul is not, he knows he's not going to get a fair trial. Festus, you know I'm innocent, and you're going to send me back to Jerusalem? You know what you're doing here is wrong. This is really what he's implying. But again, this is all humanly speaking, right? We know that Paul did not want to go back to Jerusalem because he wasn't supposed to go back to Jerusalem. He was supposed to go on to Rome. So that's what's happening behind the scenes in Paul's mind. Look at verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appeared unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Now don't get the idea that Festus, Paul makes a statement and says, no, I appeal to Caesar. And then Festus goes, hold on a minute. Let me go talk to the Sanhedrin and see what they think about it and see what we ought to do. That's not the idea. When it says that he conferred with the council, what's he doing? He's actually going to the council and he's saying, guys, I really wanted to send him back to Rome. Send him back to Jerusalem. I was going to go with you, but I can't because he's appealed to Caesar. I hope you understand. I really want to keep you guys happy. I really want to do what you guys want me to do, but I literally can't. And then he goes back to Paul and he says, fine, you want to go see Caesar, then you're going to go see Caesar. So that kind of wraps it up. So Festus doesn't make this statement suddenly. He consults with the council, who I'm sure that they were against Paul going to Rome, because if he goes to Rome, he's pretty much out of their hands. They want to see him dead no matter what. They're even willing to break the law of God. These are religious men, the Sanhedrin, right? The religious leaders. They're willing to go against all of that, and just in order to see Paul killed, in order to see Christianity stopped. That's their thinking. So they don't want him to go to Rome, but he has to go to Rome. He's appealed. So then he goes to Paul and he says, okay, fine. I'm not going to sit as your judge in this case. I'm not going to, we're done here. We're going to send you on. So verse 13 says, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. King Agrippa, and Agrippa is not an English name, so we just say Agrippa, right? Bernice is an English name. Now, if you want to get all fancy and look it up in Greek, you're going to find out it's probably pronounced Bernice. But we're not going to get fancy. We're just going to say Bernice, because after all, we are speaking English, right? So, Bernice. We have two new people coming in on the scene. Agrippa, who is described as being a king, and Bernice. So, who are Agrippa and Bernice? Interesting couple they are. Some of what I'm going to tell you is pretty downright lewd and disgusting, but just so that you know the kind of people that we're up against, I'm going to give you some historical information. So first of all, there are two King Agrippas in the Bible, all right? The first one was King Herod Agrippa the First. That's why he's the first one, who had James killed, and he imprisoned Peter in Acts chapter 12. Okay, so that is King Herod Agrippa the First. Okay, the King Agrippa of Acts 25, where we are, was his son. He is not the same guy as, chapter 12. This is his son. And his full name was Julius Marcus Agrippa. Everybody got that? There'll be a test next week. Okay. Julius Marcus Agrippa. And this is where things really start to get sick and twisted, because this Agrippa was also the brother of Bernice, who appears here as his wife. Agrippa and Bernice were brother and sister, and it doesn't stop there. He had another sister. Agrippa had another sister, and her name was Drusilla. Drusilla. Where have we heard that name before? Where? Yeah, I'm sorry, I heard about 4 people at the same time. Okay, very good. So we go back to Drusilla in Acts chapter 24, verse 24. You can kind of go back there and look at that. And so Drusilla was whose wife? So we got Felix, and now we got Festus. And so what does this mean? Naturally, this means that King Agrippa and Felix were brother-in-laws. King Agrippa, so, keeping it all in the family here. You got Felix and Drusilla, and you go on to Festus, and now we got King Agrippa stopping in for a visit. And King Agrippa was really a powerful man in Israel. Had a lot of clout because he'd been given authority to appoint the high priest. So naturally, this gives him a whole lot of power to start off with. And so he was very influential in religious affairs. Now, and the book of Josephus gives us that little tidbit information, by the way. That's not in the Bible. But it's historical and it's verifiable. But here's the thing. He has great religious authority, and yet he is not a full Jew. Mixed up world they were living in. You thought 2020 was bad. No. Bernice, his sister slash wife, yuck. Bernice, who was a year younger than King Agrippa, had been engaged to Marcus, who was a nephew of Philo the philosopher. Maybe you're familiar with the name Philo if you like history. Anyway, she married her uncle. This is a sick lady. And then after her uncle died, she went to marry her brother, King Agrippa. She finally left Agrippa later to become the mistress of the Roman general Titus. Does that name sound familiar? Yeah, so this girl, Bernice, is one sick puppy. And when I read this stuff in history, I get the feeling that she is incapable of love. Every step she made was a step of power, authority. When I read that, I was reading this a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I was getting ready to teach this. This is going on YouTube, so I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, right? But I couldn't read about Bernice without thinking about Hillary Clinton. And I'll explain why. Because Hillary Clinton knew that her husband, Bill Clinton, was a dirty, rotten, cheating, backstabbing person way early on. Why in the world she stayed married to that scumbag, I don't know. Except it was possibly because she liked the power and the fame and the money and so forth. And so I couldn't help read that without, thinking of that. But this is, whether Hillary is that way or not, I don't really know, because I don't really know her. I can only know what I read. But Bernice, and I don't really know her either. I'm not that old. I'm old, but not that old. Bernice appears to be that way. She's power hungry. Whatever she can do to be in power, be in authority. Now, it really doesn't need to be said that neither one of these people, whether it was King Agrippa or Bernice, It doesn't need to be said that they didn't have a very good reputation in Israel. Okay, the Sanhedrin had lots of issues, but not these kind. Okay, and Josephus also points that out, that they were not very highly thought of in Israel. So in Acts 25, King Agrippa and Bernice traveled to Caesarea to visit the new governor Festus, and so that's what we learn in verse 13. So in verse 14 it says, and when they had been there many days. How long are many days? They're many days. How long are many? Well, I don't know. Is it a good visit or a bad visit? Do they like each other or not? Because I have visited people that I didn't really like, and many days was 2, and that was too many. You know, and I've heard people say, and this is not true for my family. I love my in-laws. Everybody knows I love my in-laws. But there is kind of an American saying that maybe you've heard this, maybe not. And we say that in-laws are like fish. After 3 days, they begin to stink and you want to throw it out. Right? And so, yeah, you've never heard that? It's kind of funny. My in-laws aren't that way. But we say things like that, right? So it really all depends upon how well you like somebody, whether or not many days is 3 or 30. We don't know. It just says many days. Now I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably 3 weeks, maybe a month. Who knows? But they're there for a while, hanging out there for a while. And it says that Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there's a certain man left in bonds by Felix. So the way the verse is worded, it sounds as if this was not just a political visit, but more of kind of a, of a personal thing. They're getting together for a long visit. And why would King Agrippa stay with Festus many days on a political visit? I've seen political visits. They go pretty quick. The politics of the thing. They come in, they do what they need to do, check, fill the square, go home. But they're there many days. Nevertheless, whatever the case is, during that time, Festus brings up Paul. And he says, you're not going to believe this, but I got this guy named Paul here. And Felix kept him around for 2 years under house arrest. And yet, as far as I can see, ain't nothing wrong. He's been under house arrest for 2 years. I still got him because he's appealing to Caesar. I got to send him home. You're not going to believe this. This guy has been under arrest for over 2 years. And as far as I can see, he's innocent. So this is the story that Festus tells Agrippa. And Agrippa is intrigued. So in verse 15, it goes on to say, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. So he explains that Paul was truly in limbo. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, if you will. He was not sent on to Caesar. Felix had not passed judgment either. The chief priests and the elders, they had not forgotten Paul, even after 2 years. 2 years. 2 years of being out of sight. 2 years of being in prison. And they still remember Paul. They still hate him enough to want to get him. So let me ask you a question. Let's just take the year 2020. This year has been an incredible year. What is the big thing about 2020 that we'll all remember? COVID. What other big thing has happened in 2020?
Not yet. That's on the 4th.
Okay, the election hasn't happened yet, but what other big thing has happened in 2020? The what?
The riots.
Yeah, the racism, the whole big division of, the race, I was going to say race riots, but basically that's what it is. In the States, the looters and and all of that. I mean, unemployment shot up to 30 million unemployed people in America, and I don't know what it is in Korea. There's a lot about 2020 that we can think of, but because of COVID, everything else we have to sit and think for a minute. Yeah, what else has happened? What else is going on? There's been some pretty major stuff in 2020 when you think about it. But the earlier part of the year, we don't really think much about because time has gone on and other events have happened. And you got to know the same thing happened in Paul's case. He has been in Caesarea, not even in Jerusalem. He's been in Caesarea for 2 years under house arrest. If there was ever an opportunity for the Sanhedrin to kind of forget about him. This is it, but they don't. They hate him that much. He might be out of sight, but he's certainly not out of mind. So Festus says to King Agrippa, "You're not going to believe this guy. As far as I can see, he's innocent. I would have released him, but he's appealed to Caesar. I got to send him on to Caesar. The Jews, they want to kill him, and I can't see why." As we get down through here, you're going to find out that the biggest problem Festus has at this point is that he doesn't want to send him on to Caesar without a charge. He's got to have something, and he has nothing. So he explains all this. In verse 16 it says, "To whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him." Now, I kind of tricked you. I asked you about some other big things in 2020, and every American in here should have remembered the impeachment. Good night. I mean, they tried to impeach the president. But all of that kind of got overshadowed with COVID. And we've kind of pretty much forgotten that they tried to impeach the president. Even the liberals aren't even talking about it. The election's coming up, and they're not. The liberals, you would think they'd be saying, "We tried to impeach that guy." But even they've forgotten about it, it seems, right? Here, Festus, in speaking to Agrippa, in explaining what was going on, he says, "I told them that I couldn't send him down there because he should be able to answer his accusers face to face." Did you pick up on that part, the face to face part? Because, and I don't mean to get off on politics again, but this whole whistleblower thing, if I'm going to be accused of a crime, you come to me and say, "You've been accused by a whistleblower of this crime." The first thing I'm going to say is, I am guaranteed by our law to face my accuser. And that, of course, never happened because, things are different when the liberals are in charge. But, so Paul has not been afforded this. You remember what happened before Felix and before Festus? The people who grabbed him in the temple initially never even showed up for court. And Paul said, "You can't accuse me. Even these people can't accuse me. Where are my accusers?" Remember that? They should have let him go right there on the spot, but he appealed to Caesar. So Festus, he may have taken the position he took because he knew that Paul was a Roman and he appealed to Caesar. So that's probably what's going on here. Initially, he's got his mind to please the Jews, but he can only go so far. So he recognizes Paul has a legal right to face his accusers and to answer for himself. And it's interesting that in the United States, and I think in Korea too, that both of these ideas are still reflected even in our law, that we have a right to face our accusers. The word that's used here, the word translated as answer, does anybody know what it is in Greek? Interesting word. Somebody help me here. What's the word in Greek?
Is it answered, you said?
Yeah, for answered. You know? No? It's apologia. Oh, we've made that an English word now. Apology. Where we get the word apologetics. And don't confuse apology and apologetics, because in normal English usage, apology means to say you're sorry for something. But apologetics is not the idea of saying you're sorry. Apologetics is the idea of defending your faith. All right? So here, when we're finding this word answer, it is the idea of defense, okay? And it's actually translated as defense in 3 different places in the Bible, which is interesting. Or clearing, the clearing of yourself. It's translated that way in 2 Corinthians. So he is answering for himself. In other words, he is making a defense, all right? Verse 17, "Therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth." So he's sharing now, as soon as the accusers of Paul arrived, he held court. His message to the Jews in Jerusalem was not a delay, but a desire to do things above the board. That's really all he's trying to do. Verse 18, against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. So Felix thought, surely they'll have something to say. When they get up here am I, me and Paul, we're now in Caesarea, we're waiting on the accusers to come. Oh, look, there's the accusers. Okay, what did he do? And they talk. And in the back of his mind, he's going, that's it? There's nothing there. But now he's telling the story to Agrippa, and he's going, I really thought they had something on this guy, because as bad as they wanted to kill him, but after they came up and they explained their thing, I was like, that's it? What? There's nothing here. So he's explaining this, that their accusations were completely unsupportable. So in verse 19, he goes on, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition and of one Jesus. Now when you read that, you get the idea that he doesn't really know who Jesus is. Some guy named Jesus, basically, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now at this point, he shares that the Jews have not a legal problem, but a religious problem against Paul. As far as the Romans were concerned, they didn't care about that. Go ahead, go around, talk about somebody rising from the dead. No big deal. You know, that's not a violation of the law. You know, we got some crazy religions in the world. We really do. One of the craziest religions that comes to my mind right now has to do with the divine spaghetti monster. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? It started as a joke, and it really became a religion. These people half-heartedly, half-sincerely worship a bowl of spaghetti. I'm not making this up. I know you think I'm not making this up. That's wacky, crazy stuff. All right? But hey, if you want to believe that a bowl of spaghetti is God, you go right ahead. That's not impacted me at all. Right? And that's just lunatics, you know, that's crazy stuff. But the Romans didn't really care about that kind of stuff, because after all, it had literally no impact on the government. As far as they were concerned, as long as you swore allegiance to Caesar, all was good. But the Jews have a religious problem, because this guy Paul is going around preaching that there's this person named Jesus who raised from the dead, and they don't like that, because that is a direct affront to Judaism, and they have to keep that intact at all costs. So that's the biggest reason why they want to get Paul shut up. They want to get him killed. And so the way it's expressed, it sounds as if Festus really doesn't have personal knowledge of Jesus. But I think when we get more into Agrippa, we're going to find out that Agrippa has a little bit more understanding than he does. Let's do one more verse and then we'll stop. He says in verse 20, and because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. Now, this is not exactly true. All right? The passage in Acts 25 verse 9 clearly indicates that Festus was trying to please the Jews. But notice what it says, because I doubted of such manner of questions. So Festus says to King Agrippa, you know, I suspected that something was up with these guys. And he says, because I suspected that something was up with these guys, I asked him if he wanted to go to Jerusalem. Well, the truth of the matter is, he wanted to please the Jews, but he's not going to tell that to King Agrippa. That would not be the prudent thing to do. And so it's not exactly true, but there's no reason why he couldn't have had more than one motive, I suppose. I guess he could have been thinking more than one thing. But in reality, if Paul could have been found guilty, then he could not have been found guilty, then he should have been released. But adding to the difficulty of the situation, Paul has appealed. So he can't be released. And Festus can't send him up because he's got nothing to charge him with. So we'll stop here and come back next week in verse 21 and pick up from there. Any questions or comments? No questions? No comments? Okay then. Let's close in prayer and we'll be dismissed. Thank you so much, Lord.